The dense, ancient forest, a labyrinth of emerald green, swallowed the sleek silver SUV. A group of four friends, Dev, Ishik Sajid, and Vishal, embarked on a thrilling road trip, their youthful spirits as vibrant as the sun-drenched canopy above. As they ventured deeper into the verdant maze, an inexplicable sense of unease began to creep into their hearts. The road, once smooth and inviting, transformed into a narrow, winding path, shrouded in an eerie mist. A sudden, jarring jolt interrupted their journey, the SUV screeching to a halt. A flat tire. A minor inconvenience, they thought, dismissing the growing unease. As they stepped out of the vehicle, the tranquility of the forest was shattered by an ominous silence. The only sound was the distant, haunting cry of an unseen creature. A figure emerged from the shadows, its face obscured by the encroaching darkness. Its eyes, glowing with an unnatural intensity, pierced through the mist. A chilling voice, deep and menacing, echoed through the silent woods. "You shouldn't have come here." The friends, frozen in terror, exchanged terrified glances. The figure, a harbinger of darkness, moved closer, its every step a chilling reminder of their impending doom. Fear, a cold, clammy hand, gripped their hearts. Dev, the group's fearless leader, mustered his courage. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. The figure's reply was a chilling laugh, echoing through the silent woods. "You don't need to know who I am, you just need to know that you're trapped." As the figure advanced, the friends realized the gravity of their situation. The dense forest, once a place of adventure, had transformed into a sinister trap. The once vibrant hues of green now seemed to darken, mirroring the fear that consumed them. The friends, united by fear, turned to each other, seeking solace in shared terror. They knew they had to fight to survive. But against what? Against a creature of darkness, a being born of shadows. The battle was far from over, and the forest, with its ancient secrets and lurking dangers, was about to unleash its wrath. The dense, ancient forest, once a place of wonder and adventure, now transformed into a menacing labyrinth. The friends, trapped in its unforgiving grip, fought against the encroaching darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every eerie whisper of the wind, sent shivers down their spines. As the night descended, casting long, ominous shadows, the figure emerged once more. Its eyes, glowing with malevolent intent, scanned the terrified faces of the friends. With a chilling grin, it unleashed a wave of terror, summoning creatures of the night to aid its sinister purpose. The forest, once a serene sanctuary, erupted into chaos. Ghastly apparitions, born of the darkest corners of the imagination, materialized from the shadows. Their blood-curdling screams echoed through the trees, compounding the fear that gripped the hearts of the friends. Desperate to survive, the friends fought back, their courage fueled by the instinct for self-preservation. They wielded makeshift weapons, their determination as sharp as the blades they brandished. But the forces of darkness were relentless, their attacks relentless and brutal. With each passing moment, the friends were pushed to their limits, their strength waning, their hope dwindling. The forest, once a place of beauty, had become a battleground, a stage for a terrifying struggle between life and death. In a desperate bid for survival, Dev, the group's leader, rallied his friends. "We can't give up," he shouted, his voice echoing through the dense foliage. "We have to fight back, no matter what." Inspired by his words, the friends renewed their efforts. With renewed vigor, they faced the creatures of the night, their weapons raised high. The battle raged on, a symphony of screams and roars filling the air. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, a glimmer of light appeared in the distance. A narrow path, barely visible through the dense undergrowth, offered a glimmer of hope. With renewed determination, the friends pushed forward, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As they ventured deeper into the forest, they stumbled upon an ancient temple, its stone walls weathered by time. Inside, they discovered a hidden chamber, a sanctuary from the horrors that lurked outside. Exhausted but relieved, the friends collapsed onto the cold stone floor. The battle had taken its toll, but they had surrendered. They couldn't help but wonder what secrets the ancient temple held, and what other dangers might still lurk in the depths of the forest. The crisp autumn air nipped at their skin, as four friends, Sarah, Emily, Ben, and Alex, ventured into the heart of the Whispering Pines forest. The dense canopy of towering trees blocked out the sunlight, casting an eerie gloom over the forest floor. As they set up camp, the air grew heavy with anticipation, a sense of unease settling over the group. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling campfire. "Oh, come on, Em," Ben scoffed. "It's just a forest, nothing to be afraid of." But as the night deepened, their bravado began to wane. The wind howled through the trees, sending shivers down their spines. Strange noises echoed through the woods, the snapping of twigs, the rustle of leaves, and an occasional mournful howl. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Probably just a deer or something," Alex replied, trying to sound confident. As the night wore on, the eerie silence was broken by a piercing scream. A woman's cry filled with terror and despair echoed through the woods. The friends exchanged nervous glances, their hearts pounding with fear. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Alex replied, his voice shaking. "But we need to find out." Armed with flashlights, they ventured into the mist, following the sound of the scream. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees, gnarled and twisted, seemed to watch their every move. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with a haunting sadness. She was dressed in a tattered, blood-stained gown, and her hair hung loose and matted. "Please, help me," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm trapped. I can't escape." The friends exchanged terrified glances. This was no ordinary woman. Her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce their souls. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "My name is Alice," the woman replied. "I've been here for a very long time." As they listened to Alice's tragic story, they realized that she was a ghost, a spirit trapped in the forest. She had drowned in the nearby lake many years ago, her soul forever bound to the place of her death. The friends, filled with pity, decided to help Alice. They spent the rest of the night talking to her, sharing stories and laughter. Alice, in turn, shared tales of her life, her dreams, and her untimely death. As dawn approached, the friends knew they had to leave, but they promised to return, to keep Alice company and help her find peace. And so they left the forest, carrying with them the haunting memory of Alice and the mystery of the Whispering Pines. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of their encounter with Alice faded into a distant dream. Yet, the Whispering Pines forest continued to call to them, a mysterious pull that they couldn't resist. One crisp autumn evening, the friends returned to the forest, drawn by a sense of longing and a promise to keep. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the familiar chill enveloped them, and the eerie silence was broken by the rustling of leaves and the distant howl of the wind. They found Alice waiting for them, her spectral form shimmering in the moonlight. She greeted them with a sad smile, her eyes filled with gratitude. They spent the night sharing stories, laughter, and tears. Alice spoke of her loneliness, her longing for human connection, and her hope for a peaceful afterlife. As dawn approached, the friends knew it was time to leave. They promised to return, to continue their visits and offer solace to Alice's troubled soul. They left the forest, carrying with them the weight of Alice's sorrow and the hope of a brighter future for the lost spirit. The Whispering Pines forest, once a place of fear and dread, had become a place of solace and compassion. The friends had learned a valuable lesson about empathy and the power of human connection. And Alice, the ghost of the forest, found a glimmer of hope in the kindness of others. One summer evening, my dad mentioned needing some trees cleared from the deepest part of our woods. He offered to pay me more than usual for the job. A good deal, especially since I had my eye on a used dirt bike a friend was selling. So I jumped at the chance. The next morning, I loaded up the truck with all the necessary gear, including a sturdy trailer my dad let me borrow. The area he wanted cleared was a good drive away through some rough, overgrown terrain. As I set off, the morning sun cast a warm golden glow over the fields. But as I drove deeper into the woods, the path grew narrow and the shadows lengthened, thickening around me. When I finally reached the spot, I paused to appreciate the quiet stillness. Towering trees surrounded me, their branches swaying softly in the wind. It was almost peaceful. I pulled on my gloves, fired up the chainsaw, and got to work. The first few trees came down easily, and as I moved on to the next one, I got the odd feeling that I wasn't alone. Cutting the engine, I paused and listened, but there was only the usual forest noise: birds, leaves rustling, distant animal sounds. I shrugged it off and got back to work. A few hours later, I stopped to take a break. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the trees I'd cut down was missing. I stared at the stump, scratching my head because it was impossible. Trees don't just vanish. I wandered around the clearing, thinking maybe I'd moved it and forgotten, but no, it was nowhere in sight. A little unsettled, I tried to chalk it up to my imagination and got back to work. But as the day wore on, more odd things began to happen. Shadows seemed to shift just beyond my line of sight, and at one point, I thought I heard faint laughter. I told myself it was just the wind, but the feeling of being watched kept getting stronger. Every time I looked around, though, I saw nothing but trees. It was well after dark when I finally sat down for a late dinner. As I ate, I felt that prickling sensation on the back of my neck again. Scanning the perimeter, I tried to stay calm, but then I heard a rustling sound, louder this time, about 30 yards away. Bushes shook violently, as if something big was moving through them. I stood up, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called, but there was no answer. It could have been a deer or a fox, maybe even a bear, but this felt different. Deciding it was best to just finish up, I worked until I'd loaded the last of the logs onto the trailer. By then, it was late and the quiet night around me was thick, almost oppressive. I checked my watch, 11:30 p.m. Time had gotten away from me. I called home to let my mom know I'd be staying the night. "It's a nice evening," I told her. "I'd rather not drive back in the dark." "All right, honey," she said, her voice warm. "Be safe and call us if you need anything." After hanging up, I made a quick camp next to the truck, setting up a small tent and building a fire. Dinner was just some canned beans and hot dogs, but after a long day, it hit the spot. Sitting by the fire, I pulled out a book my dad had lent me, a nonfiction book about the Civil War. He's a bit of a history buff and loves folklore, so I thought it'd be a good distraction. After reading for a while, I tossed another log onto the fire and leaned back. The crackling flames were soothing, and the night was calm, until I heard a faint sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I looked up, peering into the dark just beyond the fire's glow. Just an animal, I told myself, but the sense of being watched returned, stronger than before. Trying to shake it off, I doused the fire down to glowing embers and crawled into my tent. After all the hard work, I figured I'd drift off to sleep easily, but that unsettling feeling stayed with me. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, that the weird events throughout the day had simply gotten under my skin. Sometime later, I finally dozed off. I jolted awake with a start, my heart racing. There had been a loud thump, and it had come from near the truck. I sat up, straining to listen, and then I heard it, a heavy, irregular breathing, somewhere outside. My stomach dropped. I unzipped the tent just a crack and peered out. The moonlight cast eerie shadows everywhere, and for a moment everything looked normal. The truck, the trailer, the tall trees looming in the background. Then I saw it, a shadow slipping behind a tree, too big to be any animal I knew. I froze, my breath catching. The shadow moved again, darting from one tree to the next, always just out of my full view, as if it knew where my gaze would land and dodged it perfectly. There was something disturbingly familiar about its shape, but I couldn't place it. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I gathered my courage, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the breathing started up again, closer this time. My hands shook as I swung the flashlight around, and for a split second, I saw something. A tall, gaunt figure slipping behind a tree. It was just a glimpse, but it was enough. That was it. I knew I couldn't stay out here. Moving as quietly as possible, I backed into the tent and packed up the essentials. Emerging cautiously, I made my way toward the truck, clutching the keys. The loaded trailer was heavy, and as I climbed into the driver's seat, I realized with dread that maneuvering it through the uneven terrain in the dark would be difficult. But I didn't have a choice. I started the engine, relieved at the sound, but as I put the truck in gear and tried to pull forward, the vehicle struggled. The weight of the trailer was making it nearly impossible to move quickly on the rough ground. Panic set in as I realized I'd have to unhook it if I wanted to get out fast. Every instinct was screaming to just go, to leave the trailer and run. With a deep breath, I stepped back out of the truck. The darkness was heavy, and I felt eyes on me. I tried not to look around, forcing myself to focus on the trailer hitch. My hands shook as I worked to detach it, each click of metal sounding deafeningly loud in the quiet night. Finally, it came loose, and I climbed back into the driver's seat, locking the doors as I went. As I sped down the narrow trail, trees whipped by on either side. In the rearview mirror, I could see the spot where I'd left the trailer, now empty and eerie in the moonlight. With the trailer unhooked, I jumped back into the truck, slamming the door just as a low, guttural growl echoed from the trees behind me. My heart pounded as I floored the gas pedal. The tires spun in the dirt before finding traction, and I sped off down the rough path, branches scraping against the sides of the truck. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a dark shape standing in the middle of the path, watching, but it vanished as I rounded a bend. The drive back was a blur. I barely slowed down until the comforting lights of the farmhouse appeared in the distance. Pulling into the yard, I shut off the engine and sat there, gripping the wheel tightly as I tried to calm my nerves. When I walked inside, I didn't tell my parents the whole story, just that I decided to come back early. They noticed the missing trailer, and I explained I'd left it in the woods and planned to retrieve it the next day. That night, sleep evaded me, my mind looping back to the strange events I'd experienced. The following morning, my dad and I headed back to retrieve the trailer. In the daylight, everything looked normal, quiet, still, and ordinary. The trailer was right where I'd left it, still loaded with logs. "Why'd you unhook it out here?" my dad asked as we hitched it back up. I hesitated, finally saying, "I had some trouble maneuvering last night." With a nod, he helped me secure the trailer, and as we were about to leave, I couldn't resist glancing back at the tree line. For a brief second, I thought I saw a dark figure slip behind a tree. It was probably just a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the eerie familiarity of it. Back at the house, I went straight to the bookshelf in my dad's study, searching through volumes of books I vaguely remembered from childhood. This whole experience felt oddly familiar, like something I'd read about long ago. Finally, I found it. A book on North American folklore, filled with stories of strange creatures and mysterious happenings in the wilderness. I sat down, reading through the section on forest myths, and legends until I found what I was looking for, a creature known as the hide-behind. The hide-behind was said to prey on those wandering alone in the woods, especially after dark. Descriptions claimed it could contort its body to hide behind the narrowest of trees, staying just out of sight. Victims reported feelings of dread, the sensation of being watched, and strange sounds before vanishing without a trace. As I read, a shiver ran down my spine. I'd always dismissed folklore as just stories, but the parallels between the hide-behind and my own experience were too strong to ignore. Later that day, I casually asked my dad, "Hey, have you ever heard any stories about strange things in the woods?" He looked at me thoughtfully before replying, "Your great-grandpa used to talk about odd things out there, some of the old lumberjack legends, like the hide-behind." He raised an eyebrow. "You've been reading that book, huh?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just curious." My dad chuckled. "Those are just stories, son. But I've always thought every legend has a kernel of truth. It's always good to be cautious, especially out there alone." I nodded, still feeling a touch of unease. From that day on, I avoided the deeper parts of the woods, sticking to familiar areas closer to the farm. A few weeks later, I met up with a friend who lived nearby, and to my surprise, he didn't laugh when I shared my experience. "You're not the first to feel that way out there," he said, his tone serious. "I've heard stories from some of the older folks around here. Strange things happening, livestock disappearing, eerie sounds. Some of them don't even go into the woods after dark anymore." Hearing this was both comforting and unsettling. I wasn't alone in my experience, but it also made everything feel more real. From that point on, I treated the woods with respect and a healthy dose of fear. They weren't as serene as they used to be. They were a place to be cautious, a place that held secrets. And as for the hide-behind, part of me still wonders if it's real. I haven't gone looking for answers, but the experience left a mark. So, what do you think? Have you ever felt like something was watching you out there, just out of sight? I'd love to hear if you've had any similar encounters. Thank you for tuning in to Unexplained Encounters. If you haven't already, follow and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you enjoy your favorite podcasts. While you're at it, check out some exclusive creepy merch at eeriecast.store, or explore more terrifyingly entertaining shows like Tales from the Break Room, which dives into scary work stories. For more spine-tingling tales, visit eeriecast.com. And if you'd like to listen ad-free and access exclusive horror audiobooks, join EerieCast Plus at eeriecast.com/plus. Members also enjoy monthly discounts on merch. Have a spooky story of your own? Submit it at darkstories.org. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe out there, and remember, this world is a strange one. Started on a warm summer evening. My family lived in the city, but each year I would spend a couple of weeks with my relatives who lived on a reservation. It was a tradition and a part of my heritage I always looked forward to reconnecting with. This time was especially exciting as I was going to have more time with my cousins, Daniel, who was the oldest, Mia, who was my age, and little Jonah, who always tagged along. Their home was nestled deep within the woods, surrounded by towering pine trees and the constant hum of nature. It was a world apart from the chaotic city life I was used to. Here, the air was fresher, the nights quieter, and there was a peace I couldn't find anywhere else. That night, after dinner, the four of us gathered on the porch, watching the sunset bleed into the sky with hues of orange and pink. The adults were inside, caught up in lively conversation and laughter. Daniel turned to us with a mischievous grin. "What if we went camping tonight?" he said, his voice low so the adults wouldn't hear. Mia gave him a skeptical look, one eyebrow raised. "You know Grandma and Grandpa would never let us? How many times have they told us, 'Don't go into the woods after dark'?" "Exactly," Daniel smirked, clearly reveling in his idea, "which is why we won't tell them." Jonah squirmed a little, his discomfort obvious. "What if we get caught?" he whispered, glancing nervously back at the door. I was torn. A nighttime adventure sounded thrilling, but breaking our grandparents' rule didn't sit well with me either. "Why don't we just ask them first?" I suggested, hoping that a bit of honesty might work. But Daniel shook his head. "You know they'll just say no. Come on, it'll be fun. We'll set up a tent, tell ghost stories, and be back before sunrise. They'll never even know we left." Mia looked at me, her eyes gleaming with excitement and worry. "What do you think, Alex?" After a moment's hesitation, I caved. "All right, fine, but we have to be really careful." Jonah sighed, resigned to his fate. "Okay, but if we get in trouble, it's on you, Daniel." We waited until the house had gone quiet, listening carefully until the soft snores of our grandparents signaled that the coast was clear. Around midnight, the four of us quietly grabbed supplies, sleeping bags, a flashlight, snacks, and a small battery-powered lantern, then snuck out the back door, giggling nervously at the thrill of sneaking out. The woods, which felt familiar and comforting during the day, had an entirely different energy under the cover of darkness. Shadows stretched out from the trees, and the canopy overhead seemed to close in, casting an eerie gloom over the path. The moon was out, casting a pale light that filtered through the branches, enough to guide us without turning on the flashlight. After what felt like ages, we found a small clearing by a creek, a spot we often visited during the day. The sounds of the forest were amplified in the stillness of the night. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig sent shivers down our spines. Even the breeze seemed to carry whispers as it weaved through the trees. We set up the tent together, fumbling with the poles and pegs in the dark. After a few frustrated attempts and some stifled laughs, we finally got it standing. Once inside, we huddled close, sitting around the small glow of the lantern, the dim light casting strange shadows on our faces. "All right, who's got a story?" Daniel asked, rubbing his hands together with excitement. Mia grinned, her eyes glinting with mischief. "Have you heard about the Raven Mocker?" Jonah groaned. "Not that one." Ignoring him, Mia continued, leaning in closer for effect. "The Raven Mocker is an evil spirit that steals the hearts of the sick and dying to add years to its own life. They say it can take the form of a raven or even appear human, but only medicine men can truly see it." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "That's disturbing." Daniel, never one to be outdone, leaned in. "That's nothing. Have you ever heard of the Deer Woman?" Mia rolled her eyes. Oh, please. That's just a story to keep kids from wandering off. He ignored her, his voice dropping to a whisper. They say she appears as a beautiful woman, luring people deeper and deeper into the woods. But once you're far enough, she reveals her true form, hooves for feet and the face of a stag. Jonah hugged his knees tightly, looking genuinely terrified. Can we talk about something else? To lighten the mood, I jumped in. How about the star people? You know, those beings who supposedly came from the sky to teach wisdom and knowledge to our ancestors? Daniel scoffed. That's not scary. Exactly, I replied with a grin. Maybe we've had enough creepy stories for one night. But Daniel wasn't ready to let the atmosphere slip away. Lowering his voice, he glanced around the campsite as though someone might overhear. Grandpa told me a story once. He said it was true. We all fell silent, curiosity mingling with dread. Even Jonah leaned in despite himself. What did he say? I asked, keeping my voice low. Daniel hesitated, adding to the suspense. He said that when he was our age, he encountered a skinwalker. Instantly, the mood shifted. The skinwalker was a creature everyone on the reservation knew about, but it was rarely discussed. A witch who could transform into animals using dark magic, the skinwalker was said to be dangerous and malevolent. Our elders always spoke of it with unease. I don't think we should talk about that, Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Oh, come on, Daniel said, though his bravado seemed to falter. It's just a story. Jonah looked around nervously, clutching his knees tighter. Maybe we should listen to Mia. I, however, couldn't resist. What did Grandpa say happened? Daniel's expression grew serious as he lowered his voice further. He told me that one night he was out late helping his father gather wood. They got separated, and as he was searching, he saw a coyote. But it wasn't right. It was standing on two legs like a person, and it was staring at him. The words hung in the air, each of us absorbing the chilling image. Daniel continued, his voice barely a whisper. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but then it started moving towards him. Its body was twisting, contorting, like it was struggling to stay upright. Stop, Mia pleaded, her voice strained with fear. But Daniel couldn't stop now. Grandpa said he froze, too terrified to move. And then it spoke. It said his name in a voice that wasn't human. He ran all the way home, and his father performed a ceremony to protect him. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. A chill ran through me, and I suddenly felt very aware of the darkness pressing in around us. Why would you tell that story? Mia snapped, clearly upset. Daniel looked uneasy, his earlier bravado gone. It's just a tale. Jonah's voice was barely a whisper. Do you think it's real? I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but another part of me, the part that remembered the warnings of our grandparents, felt a creeping dread. Maybe we should just go to sleep, I suggested, my voice shaky. We agreed, crawling into the tent. It was a tight fit, but huddling close together felt safer somehow. As I lay there, staring up at the fabric of the tent, shadows from the trees outside loomed and swayed, fueling my imagination. Every little sound from the forest seemed amplified, making it impossible to relax. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours, as I lay there, wide awake. Just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound like someone dragging their feet through the underbrush. Did you hear that? Mia whispered, her voice quivering. We held our breath, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, as if it was circling our tent. Wide with terror, Daniel mouthed, "What is that?" His face was pale, eyes locked on the tent's flap. He reached for his flashlight, hands shaking, and motioned for us to stay quiet. Slowly, he unzipped a small part of the tent flap, just enough to peek outside. The rest of us crowded around him, careful not to make any noise. He clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, casting light onto the trees in the clearing. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the gentle sway of branches in the wind. And then, something moved. Emerging from behind a tree was a figure unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a creature, but it seemed like some twisted mockery of one. It had the body of a coyote, yet its limbs were grotesquely long, stretched beyond natural proportions, with patches of fur missing and skin pulled taut over its visible bones. But its head, that was the worst. It was as if the flesh of a human face had been stretched over a coyote skull. its eyes sunken deep into their sockets with a faint, unnatural glow. The mouth hung open in what looked like a silent scream. The creature moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like it was struggling to control the body it had stolen. It began circling our camp, its breaths audible now, a ragged, wheezing sound that broke the silence of the night. It didn't seem to notice us, yet it was searching, its head twitching side to side, scanning the ground as if looking for something it had lost. Mia covered her mouth, trying to stifle a scream. Jonah gripped my arm so tightly it hurt. Slowly, Daniel lowered the tent flap, his face frozen in fear, and turned off the flashlight. We retreated to the back of the tent, each of us trembling, our minds racing with terror. "What do we do?" I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Stay quiet," Daniel replied, his voice so low I could hardly hear him. "Maybe it'll go away." We huddled together, hearts pounding, listening as the creature continued to circle our tent. Its heavy, wheezing breaths grew louder, closer. It felt like ages passed as we held our breath, frozen in place, too terrified to move or even blink. The creature's wheezing breaths were nearly right outside the tent, and then it spoke. "Help me." A voice rasped from outside, scratchy and distorted, like it was coming from broken vocal cords. I felt a surge of terror as I realized it was mimicking human speech. But there was something wrong with it, something hollow, as if it was trying to recall how humans sounded. "Please, help me," it whispered, dragging out each word. Jonah's grip tightened on my arm, and I felt him start to shake. Mia held his other hand, her own eyes brimming with tears, and tried to steady him. We could only sit there, paralyzed, as the voice called out again, closer this time. "Don't respond," Daniel mouthed, his eyes wide with fear. We stayed silent, hardly daring to breathe. The creature pressed against the tent, so close that its shadow loomed over us, massive and menacing. We could smell it now, an overwhelming stench of decay mixed with sulfur, like something rotting in the depths of the earth. "Why? Won't you help me?" it whispered again, the voice barely a breath. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently praying for it to leave. The wheezing breaths continued, lingering for what felt like an eternity. And then, finally, the sounds began to fade. We listened as the creature shuffled away, the raspy wheezing growing more distant, until all that remained was the usual chorus of the nocturnal forest, but none of us dared to move. Even as the sounds faded completely, we stayed huddled together, too terrified to even speak above a whisper. Dawn was still hours away, but the thought of stepping outside was unimaginable. "Do you think it's gone?" Mia finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel swallowed, his face pale. I don't know. We should wait until sunrise." And so we sat there, backs pressed against the walls of the tent, fighting exhaustion. Sleep was out of the question. Every so often, we would hear a distant sound, a rustle, a crack, and tense up all over again, fearing the creature's return. But as the hours passed, it didn't come back. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, casting a dim glow into the clearing, we all felt a surge of relief. The darkness had been like a suffocating blanket, and the daylight brought a sense of safety, if only an illusion. "We need to leave," I whispered, breaking the silence. The others nodded, too shaken to argue. We packed up in silence, stuffing our sleeping bags into our backpacks without even bothering to fold them properly. As we stepped outside, the clearing looked strangely innocent in the morning light, but the memory of the night still lingered, a dark cloud that none of us could shake. "Should we take down the tent?" Jonah asked, glancing back at it. Daniel shook his head. "Leave it. We can come back for it later." His tone was flat, drained of his usual confidence. We made our way back to the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The journey seemed to stretch on forever, as though the woods were reluctant to let us go. Finally, we broke through the tree line and saw the house in the distance. Our grandparents and parents were waiting on the porch, their faces a mix of anger and worry. "Where have you been?" Grandma demanded, her hands on her hips. Daniel lowered his gaze. We went camping. After we explicitly told you not to?" Grandpa's voice was stern and his expression hard. Mia stepped forward, her head down. "We're sorry. We thought it would be an adventure." Our parents ushered us inside, sitting us around the kitchen table. Grandpa looked at each of us intently, his gaze lingering as though he already knew what had happened. Did anything happen out there?" he asked, his voice low. We exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to say. Finally, I spoke up, my voice shaky. "Yes, sir, we saw something. Something we can't really explain." Grandma sighed, a heavy, sorrowful sound. "We warned you for a reason," she murmured, almost to herself. Grandpa's gaze was sharp. "What did you see?" His tone was calm, but there was an urgency to it, as if he already knew but needed confirmation. Daniel began to describe the creature in detail, his words spilling out as he recounted the twisted body, the human-like face, the wheezing breaths, and the whispers. Grandpa listened, his expression grim, and when Daniel finished, he nodded slowly. "It's as I feared," he said quietly. Jonah's voice trembled as he asked, "Was it a skinwalker?" Grandpa shot him a quick, warning look that made Jonah flinch. "Do not speak of it," he said firmly. "Yes, but that's all I'll say. It is what our people call Yi, a being that has chosen darkness, capable of taking the form of animals to harm others." "Why didn't you tell us before?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because speaking of them can draw their attention," Grandma said softly. "We did not want to scare you, but we hoped you would respect our warnings." We sat in silence, absorbing this revelation, each of us feeling a mix of relief and terror. "Stay inside at night from now on," Grandpa instructed firmly. "There are things in these woods that do not wish us well." We nodded, chastened and still shaken by our experience. Last summer, my friend Lily and I decided to go on an adventure. We just graduated from college and figured a little trip to France was the perfect way to celebrate before diving into our careers. We had saved up from our part-time jobs, and we planned a 2-week backpacking trip through the French countryside. Of course, we started in Paris, hitting the iconic spots like the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre. But we both wanted something a bit different, something off the beaten path. After a few days, we headed south, aiming to explore the real France beyond the bustling city streets. One region that captured our interest was Gévaudan. Lily had read about it in some historical thriller and was captivated by the legend of the Beast of Gévaudan, a creature that supposedly terrorized the area in the 18th century. Being a bit of a history buff myself, I was all in. We both loved the idea of visiting a place with a mysterious past. We arrived in a small, picturesque village called Marvejols, tucked away in the mountains. It felt timeless, with cobblestone streets and old stone houses. The locals were friendly but reserved, especially when we mentioned our curiosity about the beast. One elderly woman even crossed herself, muttering something under her breath. Unfazed, we settled into a quaint little inn for the night, planning a hike through the nearby forests the next day. The innkeeper, a middle-aged man named Jacques, was kind but stern. "Stick to the marked trails," he warned in a thick French accent. "People can get lost easily, and the wolves have been more active lately." Lily's eyes lit up. "Wolves?" she asked. Jacques shrugged. "Yes, but they usually avoid humans. Just be cautious." The next morning, we packed our backpacks with snacks and other essentials and set off. The forest was stunning, with tall trees forming a thick canopy overhead. The air was fresh with the scent of pine, and the chorus of birds filled the silence. It was exactly what we had envisioned. After a few hours of walking, we came across an overgrown path that wasn't on our map. Lily, always the adventurous one, immediately wanted to follow it. "Come on, Emma," she urged. "Isn't this the kind of experience we were looking for?" I hesitated, thinking of Jacques' warning. "He said to stay on the marked trails," I reminded her. She just rolled her eyes. "Are you really afraid of an ancient beast?" she teased. I laughed and gave in, letting her lead the way. We ventured down the unmarked path, winding deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, and a strange green light filtered through the leaves, giving the area an otherworldly feel. It was eerie but beautiful. About an hour in, we stumbled upon a clearing with the ruins of what looked like an old stone cottage. Moss clung to the walls, and it seemed nature had nearly taken the place back. Lily was fascinated, running her hands over the rough stone walls. "Imagine who might have lived here," she whispered. As we explored, I noticed strange markings etched into one of the remaining walls. They didn't look like any writing I'd seen, more like symbols or sigils. Hey, check this out, I called to Lily. She walked over, squinting at the carvings. Weird. Maybe it's some old language? Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the trees behind us, making us both freeze. I tried to calm myself, whispering, probably just an animal. But Lily looked a bit nervous now, her earlier confidence fading. Maybe we should head back, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As we turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. A large, dark shape that seemed too big to be a deer. My heart began to pound. Did you see that? I asked, my voice shaking. See what? She asked, scanning the trees nervously. I don't know. Something moved over there. We both stood still, listening, but the forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Let's go, Lily said, barely audible, and we quickly started back, trying not to panic. Every now and then, I'd hear the snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves behind us. I'd glance back, but there was never anything there. Eventually, though, we realized we weren't on the same path we'd taken earlier. My pulse quickened. Are we lost? I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Lily looked around, her face pale. Look, I insisted, scanning the trees anxiously. Lily was equally frantic, and we pulled out our map, but it was no use. We couldn't make sense of where we were, and our phones had no signal under the thick canopy. GPS was out, and the sense of isolation settled heavily between us. All right, let's stay calm, I said, trying to sound reassuring. We can retrace our steps. Just then, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. This time, we both heard it. Lily tried to joke, nervously asking if it was my stomach, but I could tell she was terrified. Instinctively, we started moving faster, the growling growing louder and closer behind us. Suddenly, Lily screamed. I whipped around to see an enormous creature emerging from the shadows, a massive animal, something that looked like a wolf, but was far too large, with thick, matted fur and menacing, glowing, yellow eyes. Its snout was longer than any wolf I'd ever seen, and saliva dripped from its bared fangs. Run! I shouted. We tore through the trees, branches scraping against us as we sprinted. I could hear the beast crashing through the underbrush close behind, gaining on us. My lungs burned, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Just then, Lily tripped over a root and fell hard. I stopped, heart racing, and rushed to help her up. Come on, I urged, pulling her to her feet as fast as I could. Behind us, the snarling grew louder. In a panicked burst, we veered left, our eyes catching sight of a rocky incline ahead. We scrambled up the rocks, clambering over the rough terrain, hoping the creature couldn't follow. At the top, we stumbled onto another trail, a marked one, this time with signs pointing the way. Relief flooded over me, and I pointed down the path. Look! That's the way back to the village. We barely had a moment to catch our breath when the beast appeared below at the base of the incline, its piercing eyes fixed on us. It let out a howl that echoed through the forest, freezing us in place. Go! Lily yelled, and we bolted down the trail, the creature slipping out of sight, but our fear urging us forward. After running non-stop for what felt like miles, we finally burst out of the forest onto a small road. There, a van was parked, and an older man was loading crates into the back. He looked up, startled by the sight of two disheveled girls racing toward him. Please help us, I gasped. He took one look at our panicked faces and gestured for us to get into the van. Without hesitation, we jumped in, and he sped off toward the village. What happened? He asked in broken English. Some kind of animal chased us, Lily explained between gasps for breath. He glanced at us, his face darkening. Ah, the beast, he murmured. You know about it? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. His expression was grim as he drove us back to the inn. Once there, we stumbled inside, exhausted and shaken. Jacques took one look at us and sighed, shaking his head knowingly. You went off the trails, didn't you? He asked, his tone gentle but reproachful. We're so sorry, I whispered. But we saw something out there, something that shouldn't exist. Jacques sighed again. The Beast of Gévaudan is not just a story. Many here have seen it over the years. Why doesn't anyone do something about it? Lily demanded, her voice shaky. Jacques shrugged with a weary resignation. What can we do? It is a curse, one that has plagued this region for centuries. That night, We locked ourselves in our room, shutting the windows tight. Neither of us slept much, and the faint sounds outside only made it harder to find rest. The next morning, we decided to cut our trip short and head back to Paris. Before we left, Jacques handed us a small pendant with an intricate design. "This is for your protection," he said solemnly. We thanked him and set off, eager to put distance between us and whatever lurked in those woods. Back in the bustle of Paris, the whole experience felt surreal. But the nightmares that followed reminded me it had been real. Occasionally I'd wake up, haunted by dreams of yellow eyes and that terrifying growl. Lily and I don't talk about it much. When people ask about our trip, we stick to the highlights: the Eiffel Tower, the cafes, the art museums. Who would believe our story anyway? But I still wonder about what else is out there, hidden in the world's dark, remote corners, waiting to be discovered or avoided. And every now and then, I can't shake the feeling that we were lucky to make it out of Gévaudan alive. I debated for a while before deciding to share this. This isn't some fabricated campfire story. It's a real event that happened a few months ago. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and my two best friends, Tyler and Greg, have been with me through thick and thin since high school. We played football together, went to college together, pretty much did everything together. Back in April, Greg's dad passed away suddenly from a heart attack. Greg was devastated. His dad had been his rock, and he was struggling to cope with the loss. After the funeral, Greg was in a dark place. Tyler and I did what we could to cheer him up, but he was barely holding on. Then one evening, out of the blue, Greg suggested we go camping. He needed some time in nature to clear his head, and Tyler and I were more than ready to support him however we could. We decided on Wayne National Forest in southeastern Ohio, a vast, secluded area of dense woods that felt like the perfect escape. Tyler had recently bought a small RV camper. It wasn't luxurious, but it had the essentials: a couple of bunks, a tiny kitchen, and a heater to keep us warm on chilly nights. That Friday, we packed our gear: sleeping bags, hiking essentials, a cooler full of food and drinks, and hit the road. The drive was filled with our usual banter, although Greg was quieter than usual. We didn't push him. We knew he needed his own time to process. When we arrived at the forest, we headed deep into the trails looking for a spot away from other campers. After navigating some narrow dirt roads, we found a clearing surrounded by tall pines and set up camp. That evening, we grilled burgers, swapped stories, and relaxed by the fire under a sky bursting with stars. Tyler, ever the astronomy enthusiast, lay back, marveling at the sight. "You don't get views like this in the city," he said, eyes wide with wonder. Greg managed to relax a bit too, not sipping his beer and even cracking a smile now and then. It was good to see him loosen up. Around midnight, Tyler had an idea. "I'm sleeping on the roof of the camper tonight," he announced. "I don't want to miss any of this." Greg chuckled, saying, "You're nuts, man." Tyler grinned back, "But I'll have the best view." He grabbed his sleeping bag, climbed on top of the camper, and settled in. Greg and I decided to head inside. It was cozy, 2 small bunks with just enough room to stand. I climbed into mine, scrolling through my phone while Greg lay across from me, lost in thought. "You doing okay?" I asked. He sighed. "Yeah, just thinking about Dad. He would have loved this." I nodded in agreement. "He was a good man," I replied softly. We fell into a comfortable silence, and before long, I started drifting off. Sometime later, I was jolted awake by a soft knocking. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, a gentle, rhythmic tap at the camper door. "Greg, did you hear that?" I whispered. He stirred, then sat up. "Hear what?" The knock came again, faint but deliberate. "Maybe it's Tyler messing with us," Greg suggested. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Are you guys awake?" I replied, "Yes. Are you knocking on the door?" The response came immediately. "Nope, but I see someone outside." My heart skipped a beat. "Who?" I texted back. His reply was chilling. "Looks like 2 kids standing by the fire pit." I showed the text to Greg. We were both bewildered. What would kids be doing out here at this hour? "Maybe they're lost," I suggested. Greg nodded, and we decided we couldn't ignore them. I called out, "Hello, do you need help?" A small voice replied, "Please, we need to use your phone." The voice was strange, flat and almost robotic. "Where are your parents?" Greg asked. "Please let us in," the voice repeated. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Something felt profoundly wrong. "We can call someone for you. Just tell us the number," I said, trying to sound calm. Silence. Then, more insistently, "We need to come in. Let us in." My phone buzzed again with another text from Tyler. "Don't let them in. Something isn't right." My fingers shook as I typed back, "What's going on?" His response was immediate. "Their eyes, they look completely black." I showed the message to Greg, who looked just as uneasy as I felt. We listened as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. "Please let us in," the voices said, growing increasingly agitated. My phone buzzed again. "They keep looking up here. I don't think they can see me, but they're acting weird." "They're circling the camper," Greg whispered. We listened as footsteps moved around us, slow and deliberate. The voice came again, "Let us in." It was right outside our window. I peeked through the curtain, but saw only a small figure near the window. "Why won't you let us in?" the voice demanded, almost pleading now. My phone buzzed. Tyler had texted, "They're trying to climb up here." One of them said, "Your friends won't help you." I showed the message to Greg, who looked horrified. "This is getting creepy," he said. We decided to bring Tyler inside. Carefully, I cracked open the door and whispered, "Tyler, come down." He climbed down, but as he reached the ground, one of the voices hissed, "Now you've made a mistake." We all jumped back into the camper and locked the door. Tyler caught his breath and told us their eyes, they were solid black. No whites, no irises. "That's impossible," I said, but Tyler was adamant. We were all shaken, trying to make sense of what was happening. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You cannot hide from us." I showed it to the others. "Did anyone give out their number?" I asked. They both shook their heads. The footsteps outside grew faster, circling the camper. "This is your last chance. Let us in," the voices demanded. We huddled together, our hearts racing. The footsteps eventually faded, and everything went silent. "Do you think they left?" Greg whispered. Tyler didn't look convinced. After waiting a while, we carefully packed up, trying not to make noise. As we stepped outside, the forest was eerily quiet. The fire had died down to glowing embers. We loaded up the camper, and just as we were about to get in, I heard it again. "Do you think you're leaving?" The voice was somewhere in the darkness. I spun around, but saw no one. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. Silence. "Let's go," Tyler urged. We jumped into the camper, and Greg started the engine. As we pulled away, our headlights briefly illuminated two figures at the edge of the clearing. They looked like kids, but their faces were obscured by shadows. We didn't stop until we reached a well-lit gas station miles away. We sat inside, trying to process what had just happened. "What the heck was that?" Greg asked, his hands shaking. I pulled out my phone and searched for any explanation. That's when I stumbled upon stories about black-eyed children, eerily similar to our experience. In the days that followed, we kept in close contact. Nothing strange happened, and Greg eventually found some peace through grief counseling. It sounds unbelievable, but facing something unexplainable that night somehow helped him realize he couldn't control everything. As for camping, we all agreed to take a break from it. So, if you're ever alone somewhere and someone knocks, pleading to be let in, think twice. It might just be worth it to stay safe. "Please let us in," the voice pleaded, just outside the camper window. I couldn't see much, just a small figure, its silhouette hazy in the dim light. Why wouldn't we let them in? The voice sounded desperate, and for a second, my heart felt like it could give in, but something didn't feel right. Then, a soft thud came from above. My phone vibrated. It was a text from Tyler. "Oh my God, they're trying to climb up here. Be careful." I typed back quickly, trying to keep my hands steady, asking him what he meant. His next message chilled me to the bone. One of them said something strange, like, "Your friends won't help you." I showed the message to Greg, who whispered, "This is getting way too creepy." I nodded. It was time to bring Tyler back inside. I opened the door just a crack, enough to stick my head out. "Tyler," I called, keeping my voice low. "Come down here, quietly." He cautiously climbed down from the roof, and as soon as his feet hit the ground, we heard it, a voice, slow and ominous. "Now you've made a mistake." We rushed back inside, locking the door behind us. Tyler was breathing heavily, glancing back toward the door. "Their eyes," he whispered, voice shaken. There were no whites, no irises, just solid black. "That's impossible," I said, but he looked straight at me, unwavering. "I know what I saw," he insisted. We sat there, each of us silent, trying to make sense of the situation. Greg suggested, maybe they're wearing contacts? Tyler shook his head. Out here, at this hour, just to mess with us? Another buzz on my phone startled us all. It was from an unknown number. You cannot hide from us. I showed it to them. Did anyone give out their number? I asked, my voice tight. They both shook their heads. Greg looked visibly shaken. How did they get your number? I have no idea, I replied, but I felt the fear rising in me. And then we heard it again. Footsteps, moving faster this time, circling the camper. This is messed up, Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible. Should we call the police? Greg grabbed his phone, but when he tried to dial, it wouldn't connect. No signal. I looked down at my own phone. The same issue. Nothing. It didn't make any sense. Same here, I whispered, my voice shaky. The footsteps grew louder, and then came the voices, more irritated than before. This is your last chance. Let us in. Just ignore them, I said, my voice barely a whisper. We huddled together, praying they'd go away. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours, and then, finally, everything went silent. The footsteps, the voices, all gone. Do you think they left? Greg asked, breaking the silence. Maybe, Tyler replied, though his voice was filled with doubt. I took a cautious peek through the window, but the darkness outside revealed nothing. Let's just wait a bit to be sure, I suggested, feeling uneasy. We stayed put for what felt like an eternity, listening to the eerie silence. The tension in the camper slowly began to lift. Greg spoke up, sounding unconvinced. Maybe it was just a prank. Tyler shrugged, glancing nervously at the door. But who would go to these lengths? Kids from a nearby town? Well, I'm not staying to find out, I said, my nerves frayed. Let's pack up and get out of here. We gathered our things as quietly as possible, each of us hyper-aware of every small noise we made. Outside, the woods were utterly still, and the fire had died down to a low glow. We loaded up the camper quickly, moving like shadows. Just as we were about to get in, I heard it. A voice, calling out from somewhere in the dark. Do you think you're leaving? My head whipped around, heart racing, but I couldn't see anyone. Who's out there? I shouted, my voice shaking. Silence. Let's go, Tyler urged, his voice firm. We piled into the camper and Greg started the engine, the tires crunching over leaves as we backed out of the clearing. As the headlights swept over the edge of the forest, they illuminated two figures standing in the darkness, faces hidden in shadow, their forms just out of focus. Did you see that? I whispered, but Greg was already gripping the wheel, knuckles white, eyes focused straight ahead. Just drive, I said, trying to shake off the eerie feeling settling over me. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station miles down the road, its fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the thick darkness we'd left behind. We grabbed hot coffee from inside, seeking warmth and the reassuring buzz of a public space. We sat down, exhausted, around a small table in the corner. What just happened to us? Greg asked, his hand still trembling slightly. No idea, Tyler replied, taking a slow sip of his coffee. But those kids, or whatever they were definitely not normal. I took out my phone, searching for anything that might explain the bizarre encounter. To my surprise, I found multiple accounts of similar experiences. Guys, look at this, I said, showing them a series of online stories. We scrolled through tales of people encountering children with pitch-black eyes who insisted on being let inside homes, vehicles, places of safety. This can't be real, Greg murmured, reading over my shoulder. But we just went through it. Tyler nodded. Yeah, we definitely did. We sat there in silence, each of us processing the events. Eventually, we gathered ourselves and decided it was time to head back home. For days afterward, we kept in close contact, sharing any small, strange occurrence. But thankfully, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Gradually, the tension eased. Greg started going to grief counseling, and the encounter seemed to help him face some of his feelings. It sounds insane, he told me one day, but going through that, maybe it helped me realize there's a lot in life I can't control. I'm glad you're doing better, I replied. He nodded, smiling slightly. Me too, but let's avoid any more camping trips for a while, all right? I laughed, grateful that things were returning to normal. Weeks passed, and I hadn't received any strange messages, nor had Greg or Tyler. Part of me hopes it was just a one-time inexplicable event, a brush with the unknown that we'll never fully understand. But if you ever find yourself alone in the dark woods and someone knocks, asking to be let in. Make sure you know who or what you're inviting in. Stay safe out there.